Nostalgia has been a concept that has interested me ever since I was old enough to yearn for what once was. Feeling that acts as a vehicle, with the past as the destination. So many things can evoke that feeling of nostalgia. Places, sounds, people. For me, it's video games. See, for me, the idea behind nostalgia is places that once seemed so familiar now seem so distant and almost changed in a way. Think about if you were to visit your old hometown after you moved away for several years. Things have changed. Shops have closed, maybe your friends have moved away. There's a new apartment complex that was built. It doesn't feel the same. And for me, some of my fondest memories that I cherish are late nights where I would hang out with my friends all night, watch horror movies, and play video games. We'd play Smash Bros. Until the early morning. Hell, I even remember my dad waking up and yelling at us because we were being so damn loud. And see, nostalgia, as much as I love it, it's sort of a double-edged sword. Because certain games will remind me of times in my life that weren't as pleasant. Like, if I was going through a difficult breakup, booting up that game of Subnautica sometimes reminds me of that. It's almost to the point where sometimes if I know I'm in a bad mood or I'm going through some rough stuff, I don't want to boot up a new game I really want to enjoy because I know when I pick it up for a second playthrough, it's going to remind me of all those times. Like, take Kingdom Hearts 2 for example. I remember I was in middle school when that game came out, and hell, I didn't even know the game came out. Me and my mother, we walked into a Kmart. I went to the game section as I always did. I looked inside the case and lo and behold, there was Kingdom Hearts 2. I was mind blown. Kingdom Hearts, back when I was a kid, you have to understand, games didn't take me a day or a week to beat. Zelda Ocarina of Time took me 4 years to beat, because I got it back when I was in first grade. Kingdom Hearts 2, on the other hand, I beat that in a single day. I remember staying up all night. I had school the next day, and I decided to say I was sick. And I remember fighting Xemnas, the final boss, and oh man. See, that's the problem with time. Things change. I remember every summer how excited I got knowing that E3 was right around the bend. Then COVID hit, and E3 is now a thing of the past. Don't get me wrong, the Summer Games Fest is absolutely amazing, but it doesn't bring me the joy of watching G4, booting up X-Play with Adam Sessler, and watching all the new games that would come out for PS3, Wii, and Xbox 360. Growing up, my family and I, we camped a lot, which meant that there was long road trips where I could look forward to playing my Game Boy Color in the car. And I remember all the nights that I spent hanging around the campfire with my family and friends, and we'd play Pokémon lit up by the campfire. And I remember all the kids I would meet, and they would have their own Game Boy Color or their own copies of Pokémon Red, Blue, Yellow, Crystal, whatever. And I would end up trading with them, and I would see Pokemon that I've never seen before because I didn't have that copy of the game. And see, back in the day, back before there was internet, there was plenty of stories similar to, I'm sure everyone's heard, this story of Mew under the truck right outside of the SS Anne. So many hours of my childhood was spent looking for and attempting to, in vain, complete the Pokedex on Pokemon Gold. Pokemon Gold was the very first experience that I ever had with Pokemon, aside from watching the cartoon on the TV when I was a kid. Pokemon Gold has a really special place in my heart. It was one of the first games that really facilitated the necessity to learn how to read, and that's what really got me into learning how to read. It wasn't the boring one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish books that I had to read back in elementary school. No, it was video games. The necessity to be able to read what was happening in the game led me to wanting to expand my vocabulary and learn how to spell and read words. And I know I'm not alone in that, because I know that video games has been a driving factor for many kids, especially growing up around the era that I did, for wanting to learn how to read. And I'm not shitting on reading by any means. Reading is only a thing that I've just recently began to reappreciate. I don't want to get off topic, but some of the books that I read in high school, they just weren't my gig. After my exposure to Pokemon Gold, I very distinctively remember going over to one of my childhood friends who, even my parents were best friends with his. I remember he had gotten a Game Boy Advanced for the first time. He was actually the first friend out of my entire friend group that had a Game Boy Advance, and he had a copy of Pokemon Ruby. And there I was with my Game Boy Color, still playing Pokemon Crystal, still in disbelief with how much of a graphical increase there was. I remembered he was right outside of the sandstorm area, and I remember seeing the weather effects on screen, and it was absolutely crazy. Because you have to understand, the only, weather effects that you ever saw in Pokemon up until that was, I believe, Rain Dance in Generation 2. So seeing, on-screen weather effects was absolutely crazy. I remember how incredibly jealous I was, and I remember begging my parents for a copy of the game. I eventually got a copy of Pokemon Sapphire, which I absolutely played into the ground. I still have the copy of the game to this day, even though the batteries have died. I still have my Kyogre that's level 100 that I very foolishly try to spam sheer cold through the entire Elite Four. And I grew up in a small town, so interest in gaming wasn't really too popular out of the class that I grew up in. There was a few nerds and a few people that played video games casually, but most of the friends that I grew up with ever since I was even before kindergarten, they ended up moving on towards more outdoorsy activities, which was never my forte. I vividly remember when the 4th generation of Pokemon came out. The interest in Pokemon, at least in my school, had fairly waned. It was well past its prime. It blew up pretty much when I was in elementary school. By the time the 4th generation of Pokemon came out, I was already in high school, and like I said, there really wasn't huge interest in Pokemon, at least where I lived. So playing the 4th generation of Pokemon by myself was a bit lonely. And that specific experience is what led up to me sort of stopping Pokemon altogether for a little bit. In fact, I completely skipped Pokemon Black and Black 2. I didn't pick up the game series again until Pokemon X and Y on the 3DS. And that was mainly because the idea of 3D Pokemon was really nostalgic for me. Because the first time I had ever seen a 3D Pokemon was in games like Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Snap on the Nintendo 64. And speaking of which, I have to say that Pokemon Snap, the original game, was such a novel concept. The idea of gotta catch 'em all was definitely taken to a completely different level when we're talking about, instead of catching Pokemon with Pokeballs, we are capturing photos of them. That concept to me when I was a kid, that was really cool. Being able to see Pokemon in their natural habitat, taking photos of them, and hell, even Blockbuster had a kiosk where you could bring in your game cartridge and print out copies of photos that you took. Pokemon has been and always will have a special place in my heart. The very first Pokemon that I ever chose was Totodile, and I make sure that I add him to every one of my teams whenever a new game comes out. In fact, the new Pokemon Legends game that's coming out, I am incredibly excited to see if there's going to be a mega form of Feraligatr. But as much as I love Pokemon, it doesn't have the same charm that it once did. Those 2D sprites are essentially timeless, and sort of comparing it to their 3D counterparts, it's almost no competition. Some of the Pokemon, they look great in 3D, but it doesn't feel right, almost. Now, I'm not saying that Pokemon shouldn't be in 3D, it's just the next natural step in game development to go from 2D to 3D, but I don't think some of the designs really translated well in that change from 2D to 3D. So whenever I boot up and I start replaying a copy of Pokemon Crystal and I see the back sprites of some of my most admired Pokemon, comparing it to some of the more goofy designs in 3D, it just sort of leaves me wishing that they sort of never went in that direction of going into 3D. And see, I'm not sure if that part of that has to do with the fact that Game Freak didn't really have a lot of 3D development experience up until Pokemon X and Y. I mean, they have that new game coming out that looks pretty dang good, but I don't know how, and I can't justify the fact that the literal largest multimedia franchise on the entire planet has graphics that look like this in 2025. And I'm not saying that every game that comes out has to have AAA quality graphics. It really doesn't. It's just, even stylized graphics look great. But what Pokemon's doing now, it just seems, there's really no PC way to say this. It seems half-assed. See, Pokemon Sword and Shield, when that game came out, it was the next step in 3D Pokemon. It went from Pokemon X and Y and Sun and Moon to the next generation on the Nintendo Switch. So there's really no excuse for animations to look this bad, in my opinion. Like, come on, Game Freak, you gotta get your shit together. And I genuinely don't think that you really need to have cutting-edge graphics for a game to be incredibly enjoyable. Hell, one of my all-time favorite video games that I still play to this day is old-school RuneScape. See, when I was growing up, I went through the dot-com boom, which means that I experienced the explosion of Flash games on browsers. And one of the most, I think, influential games on my life was RuneScape. See, the concept behind RuneScape to me as a kid was absolutely unfathomable. I was able to log in and be in a virtual world where I was able to play with somebody and talk to somebody who was literally on the other side of the entire planet. That was crazy. You have to understand, the only multiplayer experience that I had up until that point was playing couch co-op on my Nintendo 64. So being able to play and talk to someone who was from Australia, from Britain, from any of these places, it was just crazy, and it completely blew my mind. And one of the first online friends that I had ever made was somebody who went by the name of Mills Iverson. Him and I, we would spend hours down in the Varrock sewers together, killing zombies, and in fact, when I got my membership, he was the one who helped me get through White Wolf Mountain in one piece. Eventually, one day, he logged off and I never saw him online again. And unfortunately, it looks like Jagex may have wiped his name since then. Mills, if you're out there, buddy, I really hope that you see this, and I hope you're doing well, man. Miss killing those zombies together. And now that I'm in my 30s and I have a full-time job and I'm a father, it's difficult to find time to play video games, which I know will be short-lived, as my son is already 3, and eventually I will be playing video games alongside him, and he'll be forming his own memories and his own nostalgia. There are certain games that are just timeless, in my opinion. For me, it's Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, Zelda, Pokémon. Any of these games I can boot up at any time, and it instantly transports me back to when I was a kid, sitting in my room drinking Sunny D. It helps me to forget the fact that I work in an office cubicle similar to the main character from Stardew Valley. And I think that's part of the reason why nostalgia speaks to me so much, is because it takes me back to a time when I didn't have to worry about paying the bills. I didn't have to worry about things like taxes and stuff. And while time, it seems to only ever dredge forward, nostalgia gives you a way of sort of going back in time, even if it's only mentally. That escape, it's like a high. And don't get me wrong, I'm plenty happy where I am currently in life. It's just nothing beats that joy of a child where you literally didn't have a single care in the world. And I know I'm not the only one that shares this ideology, because the idea of nostalgia, old games, and the feeling it invokes has been something that's been blowing up on YouTube for quite some time now. And while I'm sure that my video might drown in the hundreds of other videos on this exact same concept, I hope that my personal view gives you some sort of unique perspective as to what nostalgia really means to me. Prior to the current generation of consoles, I pretty much owned every main console that came out ever since the NES. Aside from, and please don't hate me, I don't have a Dreamcast. I do have every other Sega console that came out prior to that. And while I have a gaming PC, I haven't had a desire to buy any sort of current generation of console, aside from maybe the Switch 2, which I'm still on the fence about. I mean, I gotta admit that Donkey Kong Bonanza game looks pretty cool. Really starts to bring out that memory of Donkey Kong 64. The majority of games that I owned growing up were primarily platforming games, so Donkey Kong 64 was the very first Nintendo 64 game that I had ever owned, and in fact, back before I even knew that Banjo-Tooie, which surprisingly, yes, I owned Banjo-Tooie prior to ever owning Banjo-Kazooie, I noticed the differences in style and in gameplay between Banjo-Tooie and Donkey Kong 64. That style of platforming game and just the idea of exploring these grandiose worlds was such a alien concept to me, and I'm not even kidding, probably several thousand hours of my childhood playing Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Tooie. Prior to ever owning a video game console myself, the majority of video game access and experiences that I had were playing the Super Nintendo at a childhood friend of mine. Actually, the same friend of mine that I referenced earlier with Pokémon Sapphire. He had an older brother, so there was plenty of games in which they had where it was multiplayer. So we played a lot of Super Mario Kart, and another game I can't really remember the name of, but I remember it scared me when I was a kid. It had, I think it's called, actually now that I'm thinking of it, it's called Pocky and Rocky. I remember there was a specific part where it was like a stormy area and there was a skeleton, and that skeleton ended up cornering me and killing me. But yeah, that was prior to owning my first video game console. That was my primary and only experience having a video game. So back when I opened up my present on my birthday back in 1999 and I saw a Nintendo 64 box, which was empty because my parents decided to fool me and get me an empty box. No, they actually had just set up the Nintendo 64 because they knew that I was way too impatient to wait for them to set it up myself. When I opened that box, and the very first and only game I had gotten for my birthday was Donkey Kong 64, booting up that game and seeing that 3D world open up on the TV right in front of me was a memory that is so engraved in my brain. I feel like that will be in my final 7 minutes on this earth. Replaying through my head, watching the title screen boot up and Donkey Kong falling from the top of the screen while holding a barrel, asking you to select which game mode that you wanted to play. Back then, I had thought that just the tutorial area was amazing. It was such a huge area to explore. I mean, compared to games nowadays, it's just a small backyard, but for me, the Donkey Kong Treehouse area, the music, there is not another experience in my life similar to that. If I could relive any moment, it would be that first time hearing that theme from inside DK Island. I have that song playing on my playlist in the car while I'm working in my cubicle. Hell, even while I'm editing this video, I'm listening to that song right now. Music that was made by David Wise and Grant Kirkhope, specifically songs like Sticker Brush Symphony and Aquatic Ambience, they are ethereal in nature. There's really no other way of putting that. I remember when I finally made it out of the tutorial area in Donkey Kong, I eventually made my way to K. Lumsey's lair where he was held captive, and the scope of that character size, he scared the living hell out of me. Not to mention, especially when the storm starts, right when you're starting to swim up towards K. Lumsey's prison, and it starts to thunder and lightning and rain. But I remember specifically seeing a barrel that I was completely unable to interact with, and only by looking in the game manual was I able to understand that there was other characters. It wasn't just Donkey Kong that I got to play as, and I mean, yes, if I had paid attention to the opening of the game, I would have seen all 5 of the characters in the very infamous DK rap. But see, to me, I had only ever played games where if there was an item on screen, you could instantly interact with that. Having multiple characters where I had just believed that moments before, the tutorial area was just the only area in the entire game, and I was still happy with that. The fact that now this whole world was unfolding right in front of me, where prior to video games, the only experience I had ever had was with TV shows, which you could not interact with. Watching this world unfold before me, not knowing what the next level would bring me, is a feeling that I have forever pursued since that experience. I have always sought and chased after that feeling. And of course, being in first grade when I got my first video game console, I wasn't the best at video games. So my dear mother, she would sit next to me after we had went to Kmart, Walmart, or wherever, and she would buy me the Prima guides for the games. And I love that woman to death. She would sit right next to me and spend hours just reading from the guidebook, telling me where to go, what to do if I had gotten lost, which had happened quite often. In fact, I remember most nights after school, once I had finished my homework, my mother, she would sit next to me, and especially with Zelda Ocarina of Time, those dungeons were no joke, especially the Water Temple, which I'm not even going to begin to comment on. I mean, as I've gotten older and I have done countless 3-heart runs of Ocarina of Time, I know that game inside and out like the back of my hand, but back when I was a kid, I wasn't even able to get to the Deku Tree dungeon without the help of my mother. I remember I had booted up the game and I wasn't able to figure out where to go. I was just running around aimlessly. I remember when my dad had come back from work, he had bought the game guide for me, so I was able to finally progress in the game. And my mother had pulled up the page where I was at and told me that there was a hole up on a hill that I had to crawl through, and then a maze with a boulder I had to dodge to get my very first sword, so that asshole Mido would let me through so I could experience my first dungeon. And I just need to say, that moment when I finally had gotten through that dungeon and got to Goma, and that moment where Goma locked eyes with me, oh my god, I had nightmares for so many nights. And that moment right there, after I had witnessed the death of the Deku Tree and had left the village in which I had spent quite literally the last week of my personal life in, getting lost and trying to figure out where to go, that moment of finally making it out onto Hyrule Field and that scene with Saria, that scene right there, I had never had a feeling like that until eventually Kingdom Hearts, which in that moment on the bridge where Saria looks at you as you're about to leave, asking where you're going, saying that she knew that this day would eventually come. That was the very first time that I had cried because of a game, and it definitely was not the last. When she gave me that fairy ocarina and I had left the forest, I had felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. And I think that might be the very first moment that I had ever felt nostalgia. I was leaving a place that I had called home, and I was starting an adventure of my own. I was going to go to Hyrule Castle and experience one of the best video games of all time. And at the time, I did not know it. I knew that I was experiencing something special. I just didn't know that at the time I was experiencing one of the most influential video games of not just my life, but in the entire world. From that day forward, I had an obsession with Zelda. I remember how incredibly excited I was when I got that Nintendo GameCube and a copy of Wind Waker. The vast and open seas were crazy, and as I got older and edgier, I definitely got into Twilight Princess. That was an incredibly dark Zelda game, and I love it to this day. Now, you have to bear in mind, life doesn't always work out like a YouTube video would make you seem. Majora's Mask, I didn't end up playing until I was in high school, despite the fact that I had grown up with a Nintendo 64 throughout my entire time in elementary school. Majora's Mask I had thought of as a foreign game almost. I had no desire of playing it because I was so obsessed with Ocarina of Time. It seemed so completely different. The 3-day cycle to me was just didn't seem interesting. I think Ocarina of Time would be the game that I have the most amount of hours in. For me on Steam, it's currently Dungeon Defenders at almost 2,000 hours, but overall, my entire lifespan, I would have to say it's definitely Ocarina of Time. My friends and I remember how he had somehow gotten the Ice Arrow, and for me, I was not able to do the Gerudo Training Ground. So for me, seeing him having the Ice Arrow and I had that empty inventory slot, it made me begin to wonder if there was other secrets and items I had never seen in the game. So I spent countless hours just scouring every inch of Hyrule, looking for every collectible and every item I could. Another game that was near and dear to me was the Banjo-Kazooie series, specifically Banjo-Tooie. Now, I know I might have some bias, as Banjo-Tooie was the first experience I had with the Banjo-Kazooie series. Banjo-Tooie, and I still say this to this day, even after playing Banjo-Kazooie hundreds of times to this date, something was so special about the way that the worlds interconnected within Banjo-Tooie that wasn't at all like how it was in Banjo-Kazooie. In the first game, you would end up creating or fixing a portrait of sorts with a Jiggy, or several Jiggies in this case. while yes, you would have a magical sky beam open up the next level, there were tunnels and there was a train, in fact, that could take you between each world, and that fact alone made the entire world feel so alive, and it made it feel so real in a way. Instead of hopping through a magical picture, you were able to just step foot through a gate and you were in a fantastical circus world of Witchy World. And of course, the endlessly talented Grant Kirkhope provided all of the music for that game, and that entire soundtrack is timeless, in my opinion. It's unfortunate that within recent years, I feel like YouTubers have taken an attack on the 3D platforming genre, almost to the point where I feel like Nintendo has sort of been turned off to the idea of making more 3D platformer games, which were the games that made them so popular. In fact, all of the games that have come out ever since Donkey Kong Jungle Beat have all been 2D, well, 2.5D platformers. See, a lot of people complained about the number of collectibles that were in games like Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64, but in my opinion, and in their defense almost, the majority of those collectibles aren't even really required to beat the game. If you want to just play the game, have fun, and experience all the worlds, you absolutely can. In fact, I don't even think half the collectibles are even needed to complete Donkey Kong 64. It's just the fact that those collectibles are there is nice for people like myself who actually enjoy the concept of collecting things. There's just something about monkey brain see shiny thing, must collect, that was just so satisfying to me, and I'm not even shy to admit, still it's satisfying. And back in the mid-2010s, back when Yooka-Laylee was announced, I remember the excitement that I had where I had felt something that I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I was getting a new Banjo-Kazooie game, even though it wasn't Banjo-Kazooie. Yooka-Laylee is essentially that. It was made by the same exact development team that had made the games that I grew up with and I loved so dearly. I had actually invested over $300 in that Kickstarter, and I have to say it is a bucket list item to have my name in the credits of a game that I love so incredibly dearly. Now, I know that might be biased, and I am not going to be ashamed to say that I am and was slightly disappointed with the overall quality of Yooka-Laylee. But I think a lot of that has to do with the absolutely monumental standards that I held for rare titles. And by rare, I mean rareware. I think that I might have set my expectations too high to the point where even if they made the perfect game, in my eyes, it still would not have been good enough. And don't get me wrong, I know that I'm being incredibly harsh on Yooka-Laylee. It's a game that I love dearly, but again, a lot of the levels, it just felt empty. Specifically, the casino level. It felt so empty yet having so much stuff. So many of the bosses just didn't feel like they really fit with the game. I remember having to explain back when I worked at Target to my supervisor that I was requesting a week off of work so I could play a video game. The look that she gave me was one of disbelief, but it was very clear that I was a nerd, so she didn't really question it and just approved my week off, which was amazing. I then also remember how I had not understood the concept of time differences, so when the game had said it was going to be launching at midnight, I had gotten the date completely wrong, so I had to wait an entire 24 hours for the game to come out so I could download it. But I remember how I wanted to be in the proper mindset back when I said earlier where I want to make sure that I'm not going through rough stuff or having an incredibly difficult time. I want to make sure that with certain games that I know are going to be special, I want to make sure I am in the best mental state possible. So when I pick up that game again in the future, or when I'm experiencing that very first playthrough, the very first time I experience that game, it's completely unadulterated. And the fact that I even have to do that feels almost like a problem, because I remember back when I was a kid, I could just boot up a game, I was happy as hell. And again, I'm not unhappy. It's just, as an adult, it's very easy to get into a cycle of stress or dullness almost. Waking up and going to work, coming home, going to sleep, and just going through that cycle. It can be very draining. So making sure that I'm in the right mood and I'm spending time with family, finding that balance to escape back into nostalgia, experience a video game world for the first time, it's something that's incredibly special to me. That first dive into Minecraft, Subnautica, Dark Cloud, Pokémon, a new Zelda game, that first step into those virtual worlds is something that I will forever crave. I will use video games as an escape from stress in life. It's just, again, like I said, it's sort of a double-edged sword. Because when I boot up that game for a second time, or I see that game sitting in my Steam menu, if I was going through some really tough stuff, it's going to remind me of that when I boot it up. And I don't know if that feeling is exclusive to just myself, or if I'm hyper fixating on negative aspects of my life. I promise you I'm not. Even if this video may not seem it, I am a very cheerful person. I am known as the office clown. And I think the reason for that is, as we get older, it becomes a little bit harder to rekindle that childhood wonder. And at the end of the day, every game that I buy becomes a memory that I place on the shelf once I've completed it. And I'm able to pick up that memory, and I can play it at any time where I feel like revisiting the past. And for me, a lot of my childhood consisted of playing video games, so most of my nostalgia is filled with them. And I think that's why video games are so special. They're, in their own rights, a time capsule. They take you back to that first time you booted up that game. Now, this video, it's been 6 months in the making for me. 6 months of picking up the mic, putting it down, wondering if this would all be worth it or not. This recording right here, this outro, I started this project back in July of 2025, and it's now January 4th. When I'm recording this outro. Since then, I've bought a Switch 2. I bought Pokemon Z to A. I bought Donkey Kong Bonanza. And those are, well, at least Donkey Kong Bonanza is a wonderful game, but life just gets in the way sometimes. And that's okay. This project from the start, I knew it was going to mean a lot to me, and I sort of had self-doubts as to whether or not I'd be proud of it at the end. And I think I can truly say that at the end of the day, I'm really happy I decided to follow through, even if it did take me half a year. And if this is the kind of content that you like and you'd like to hear my voice talk about other games or other concepts, then let me know. This was sort of a passion project for myself. If you've managed to stick around to the end of this, I just want to let you know that I am truly, genuinely thankful. Thank you.